story of Jeffrey Dahmer begins not with the screams of his victims, but with silence. He was born in 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a quiet child in a fractured household. Neighbors described him as shy, almost invisible, but inside, darker currents stirred. His father taught him how to bleach animal bones, a detail that seemed harmless then, but would echo monstrously later. While other children played, Jeffrey dissected roadkill in the woods. It was here that fascination with death replaced the innocence of youth. As Jeffrey grew, the distance between him and the world widened. His parents' marriage collapsed, leaving him more isolated than ever. By high school, his drinking was a daily routine, masking the loneliness that gnawed at him. Classmates recalled his odd behavior, mocking seizures, laughing at strange times, always the outsider. Yet no one could see the storm brewing inside. Beneath the quiet exterior lay urges that words could not contain. The fantasies began to take shape in his teenage years. While others dreamt of futures and romances, Jeffrey dreamt of control, possession, and keeping others from leaving him. He felt powerless in his life, but in these fantasies he was godlike. Soon, thoughts of corpses and domination consumed his mind. It was a hunger without language, one that would demand to be fed. In 1978, Jeffrey Dahmer claimed his first victim. He was only 18. Stephen Hicks, a hitchhiker, accepted a ride from the lonely young man. What began as a drink together at Dahmer's house ended with a dumbbell crushing Hicks' skull. In panic, Dahmer dismembered the body, scattering the remains in the woods. For a brief moment, the hunger was quieted, but once awakened, it would never rest again. After that first killing, Dahmer drifted aimlessly. He enrolled in college but dropped out within months. Alcohol was his constant companion, numbing both his loneliness and his guilt. His father tried to help, sending him to live with his grandmother in hopes that her faith would guide him. For a while, the killings paused, but the fantasies only deepened. Jeffrey was biding his time, waiting for another chance. But unlike many killers, Dahmer didn't immediately continue. For nearly a decade, he drifted in a haze of alcohol, military service, and failed jobs. He joined the army, but his drinking ruined his career, and he was discharged. He tried living with relatives, but his erratic behavior pushed them away. He worked in factories, blending into the background, invisible yet dangerous. But the urges never left. They grew louder, demanding release. Jeffrey was a predator pacing in his cage, waiting for the lock to break. And in 1987, it finally did. That year, in a hotel room, Dahmer claimed his second victim, Stephen Twomey. Jeffrey would later say he had no memory of the act, only of waking up beside a lifeless body. Panic gave way to ritual. He dismembered the body, carefully discarding the remains. For the first time in nearly a decade, the fantasies became reality again. This killing reawakened something dangerous in him. Jeffrey had discovered an intoxicating truth. He could control life and death entirely. From that night on, the killings became more frequent, and Milwaukee became his hunting ground. Bars and nightclubs became his stalking grounds. Young men, often from marginalized communities, vanished after nights of laughter and music. Jeffrey lured them with promises of money or companionship, offering drinks that were secretly laced with sedatives. Once unconscious, his victims were at his mercy. Strangulation became his method, followed by dismemberment. Polaroid photos captured every stage, alive, unconscious, and after death. Each picture was a souvenir of control, a way to freeze possession in time. To the city, they were simply missing persons. To Jeffrey, they were trophies. Inside his apartment, Jeffrey's world was a carefully crafted chamber of horror. Skulls were bleached and painted, arranged neatly in his closet. A large blue barrel filled with acid sat in his bedroom, slowly dissolving human remains. His refrigerator became a storage unit for severed heads and organs. He took Polaroids obsessively, building an album of terror. Yet when neighbors asked about the strange smells, he always had an excuse. Spoiled meat, bad plumbing, dead fish. And somehow they believed him, Dahmer's lies were as chilling as his crimes. Neighbors often complained of the smells. They heard the buzzing of saws, the clinking of tools at odd hours, even cries in the night. But Jeffrey smiled politely, offering explanations that sounded just reasonable enough. One time he blamed rotting meat. Another time, exotic fish gone bad. His landlord accepted the excuses, unwilling to look deeper. And police? They had been called but never searched thoroughly. Dahmer thrived in the blind spots of a system that failed to see him for what he was. By 1991, his obsession had escalated to frightening levels. Jeffrey fantasized about building a shrine, a temple of bones, skulls, and photographs. He imagined a black table surrounded by candles, where he could sit in silent worship of his victims. To him, these weren't murders, they were acts of possession, creating a world where no one could leave him. The refrigerator, the freezer, the barrel, all were parts of this twisted vision. And the killings didn't slow, they intensified. His private world was on the brink of discovery. On July 22, 1991, Jeffrey lured another man, Tracy Edwards, into his apartment. At first, Edwards played along, but soon he noticed the strange smells, the blue barrel, the knives. When Jeffrey tried to handcuff him, panic set in. For hours, Edwards sat in fear, Jeffrey watching him with cold detachment. Then, in a desperate moment, Edwards struck back and bolted for the door. With one cuff still dangling from his wrist, he sprinted into the street, flagging down police. This escape would change everything. When officers followed Edwards back to the apartment, they expected a misunderstanding. What they walked into instead was a nightmare. In the refrigerator, they found a human head carefully wrapped in plastic. In the freezer, more body parts stored like groceries. Polaroids filled drawers, showing dismembered men posed in grotesque ways. And in the bedroom, the infamous blue barrel, filled with dissolving remains. The apartment itself seemed alive with secrets. This wasn't just murder, it was ritual. The arrest made headlines across the world. Jeffrey Dahmer, the quiet man in Milwaukee, was revealed as one of history's most disturbing killers. Cameras swarmed the building as forensic teams carried out box after box of evidence. Families of missing men waited in agony for confirmation of their worst fears. Reporters gave him names: the Milwaukee Cannibal, the monster next door. The city was stunned, and the world was horrified at the horrors hidden in plain sight. In interviews after his arrest, Dahmer spoke with a calmness that was more terrifying than rage. He admitted everything: luring, killing, dismembering, even consuming parts of his victims. He spoke of his obsession with keeping them close, even after death. He confessed to boiling skulls, preserving organs, and experimenting with creating zombies through crude lobotomies. His voice carried no emotion, no remorse, just matter-of-fact honesty. To the public, it was almost worse than the crimes themselves. Court proceedings began, and the world listened in disbelief as the details unfolded. Families of the victims sat in the courtroom, some trembling, some weeping, as prosecutors described what their loved ones endured. Dahmer sat quietly, often staring into space, occasionally looking down at his hands. He pled guilty but insane to multiple charges, admitting to 17 murders. Psychiatrists debated whether he was a monster born or created. The trial became less about guilt, already clear, and more about the depth of his darkness. Each testimony painted a portrait of horror. Forensic experts detailed the acid-filled barrel, the Polaroids, the dismembered remains cataloged from his apartment. A detective described opening the fridge and realizing he was staring at human flesh. Family members of victims broke down as they heard the gruesome details. Reporters scrambled to capture every word, the public glued to their televisions. It wasn't just a trial, it was a collective confrontation with evil. Milwaukee had never seen anything like it. When Dahmer spoke, it wasn't with rage or defiance. It was chillingly calm. He told the court he killed not for hate, but for control. He said he never wanted his victims to leave, even in death. His voice was flat, almost academic, as if describing a science experiment. Jurors shifted uncomfortably, some unable to look him in the eye. His confessions felt less like apologies and more like windows into a mind completely detached from humanity. The jury deliberated, but the outcome was inevitable. Jeffrey Dahmer was convicted of 15 counts of murder and sentenced to 957 years in prison. As the judge delivered the sentence, families of victims embraced, some sobbing, others whispering prayers. Reporters rushed outside to broadcast the historic judgment. Dahmer stood motionless, showing no visible reaction. For the first time, it seemed the monster was caged, and the city of Milwaukee could breathe again. Prison life for Dahmer was complex. Some inmates despised him for his crimes, labeling him the worst kind of killer. Others bizarrely admired him, fascinated by the infamy of his name. In interviews, he claimed to have found God, reading the Bible daily. But to many, redemption was impossible. His presence in the prison was like a shadow, haunting both guards and inmates. Some saw him as a man broken, others as evil personified. Even in prison, Dahmer became a subject of fascination. Documentaries, interviews, and books dissected every detail of his life. People asked, how could someone so ordinary-looking be capable of such horror? Neighbors remembered him as quiet, awkward, even polite. Teachers described him as intelligent but troubled. The contradiction made the story even darker. Evil hadn't worn a mask. It had lived quietly next door, unnoticed until it was too late. But prison walls did not shield him forever. On November 28, 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer met his own violent end. While on work duty, he and 2 other inmates were left unsupervised. One of them, Christopher Scarver, turned on Dahmer with brutal force. Using a metal bar, he struck him repeatedly until he collapsed. By the time guards arrived, Dahmer was lifeless on the prison floor. The man who had taken so many lives was finally dead. News of Dahmer's death spread instantly. Some families of victims felt relief. Others said it denied them the chance to see him suffer in prison. Reporters swarmed the prison gates once again, broadcasting the end of one of history's most infamous killers. While some mourned the lack of justice, others said it was poetic, that Dahmer himself met a violent end. The world, however, remained fixated on the story long after his death. The legacy of Jeffrey Dahmer is not only his crimes but the questions he left behind. Could the system have stopped him sooner? Neighbors reported smells, screams, suspicious behavior, but no one acted. Police had even returned a drugged boy to Dahmer after he convinced them it was a domestic dispute. That boy was later found dead. Every missed chance became another scar on the community's conscience. The horror wasn't just in what Dahmer did. It was in how long he was allowed to do it. Today, Dahmer's apartment building no longer stands. It was demolished in the mid-1990s, a symbolic attempt to erase the horrors that happened inside. Yet the memory lingers. Documentaries, films, and even dramatizations continue to retell the story. Some criticize this obsession, arguing it glorifies a killer. Others say it serves as a warning, a reminder of the darkness lurking in ordinary faces. Either way, Jeffrey Dahmer remains carved into true crime history. Psychologists continue to study Dahmer's mind. Some see him as a textbook sociopath, others as a man warped by isolation, childhood trauma, and obsession. His need to control, his fear of abandonment, his compulsion to preserve. These traits fascinated experts for decades. Yet no single explanation satisfies. Was he born evil or did circumstances shape him? The debate endures, each theory reflecting humanity's struggle to understand monsters in human form. For survivors and families of victims, however, explanations bring little comfort. They live with the scars of loss, remembering the young men whose lives were stolen. Many were marginalized, ignored by society even in death. Their stories deserve to be told, not just as victims of Dahmer, but as human beings with dreams, families, and futures. In their memory, community groups have worked to ensure justice failures like this never happen again. Dahmer's story is a reminder of evil's banality. He wasn't a shadowy figure in the dark. He was the neighbor who waved hello, the man buying groceries, the quiet loner in the building. Evil can live in plain sight, hidden behind ordinary faces. That truth unsettles us because it strips away the illusion of safety. It tells us that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the man next door. Even decades later, the fascination with Dahmer persists. New documentaries, dramatizations, and podcasts retell his story to new audiences. Some are horrified, others morbidly curious. His case has become part of true crime culture, etched alongside names like Bundy and Gacy. But unlike many killers, Dahmer's crimes carried an extra layer of grotesque horror: cannibalism, preservation, and ritual. That's why his name endures, haunting the public imagination. Yet, with every retelling, we risk forgetting the victims. Men like Stephen Hicks, Stephen Twomey, Tony Hughes, Conorak Synthesumphone, and many others. Each was more than a name in a courtroom. They were sons, brothers, friends. Their absence still echoes through the lives of those left behind. If Dahmer's story is to be told, it must be alongside theirs, so they are not swallowed by the darkness of his infamy. The chilling truth of Dahmer's case is not just what he did, but how long he got away with it. For years, he operated unnoticed, even when the signs were obvious. Police dismissals, societal prejudice, and blind trust allowed him to continue. His story forces us to confront uncomfortable realities. How often do we ignore the strange, the suspicious, because it's easier to believe the lie? In that silence, predators thrive. If not for Tracy Edwards' escape, Dahmer might have continued for years. That night in July 1991 was not just a turning point. It was the end of a reign of horror. A single act of courage exposed a nightmare hidden in plain sight. Edwards didn't just save himself, he stopped a monster. His bravery remains one of the few glimmers of light in a story otherwise drenched in darkness. The fascination with killers like Dahmer also reflects something deeper in society. We are drawn to the darkness, wanting to understand it, even while fearing it. Some seek to find meaning, others simply watch in disbelief. His story is retold because it embodies the extreme limits of human cruelty. And yet, it also reminds us of resilience, of families, survivors, and a city that had to confront unthinkable evil. In the end, Jeffrey Dahmer's story is not one of mystery, but of horror laid bare. Unlike killers who deny or excuse, he confessed openly. He told the world exactly what he had done, with a chilling lack of emotion. That transparency left no room for speculation, only revulsion. His life became a testament to the depths humanity can fall, when obsession overrides morality and loneliness turns into lethal compulsion. But while Dahmer is dead, his story lingers, serving as a cautionary tale. It warns us about the dangers of isolation, of ignoring warning signs, of dismissing the vulnerable. It forces us to remember that evil can grow quietly, feeding in silence until it erupts. His case isn't just about one man. It's about the failures, the blind spots, and the chilling reminder that monsters can be ordinary. The true crime world will never stop telling Dahmer's story. Each generation rediscovers it, horrified yet compelled to listen. But beyond the fascination lies the most important truth. His victims were people, not props in his twisted fantasy. Remembering them is the only way to reclaim the story from the man who stole so much. In their memory, we confront the darkness, and in their memory, we find strength. For Milwaukee, the scars remain. Survivors still walk the same streets, remembering the years when friends vanished without answers. Families still live with the echoes of unanswered knocks, empty chairs, and broken futures. Dahmer may be gone, but the pain lingers, woven into the fabric of the community. The city has rebuilt, but the story is never far from its shadows. To this day, his name sparks debates about justice, about evil, about human nature itself. Some see him as proof of society's failure, others as a singular monster beyond explanation. His actions remain one of the darkest chapters in criminal history. And though he is gone, the questions he leaves behind may never have answers. Perhaps that is what makes his story endure. It is not just about him, but about us. When the world recalls Jeffrey Dahmer, it recalls not only the horror of his crimes, but the chilling normalcy of his disguise. He wasn't a shadowy stranger. He was the man you passed in the hallway, the quiet neighbor with a half smile. That is what terrifies us most. That evil wore no mask, and that we never saw it coming. His story forces us to look closer, to question what hides in plain sight. And so, Jeffrey Dahmer's story ends not in mystery but in horror and tragedy. A tale of loneliness, obsession, brutality, and failure. Failure of institutions, of neighbors, of justice delayed too long. His crimes shock us not only for their cruelty but for their proximity to everyday life. It is a story we wish we could forget, yet cannot. For in remembering, we hope to prevent it from ever happening again.